Welcome welcome to another session of Israel Dialogues, sponsored by the Israel Committee of Holy Blossom Temple. We're glad to see you all here. We're looking forward to a very interesting and informative discussion with our old friend Asher Susser again. And so without any further ado, I'll turn it over to David to start
Thank you.
our procedure off.
Thanks, Les, and welcome everyone. It's always a pleasure to have Asher Susser join us for Israel Dialogues. He's well known to the Israel Dialogues community and indeed to the academic community in North America, Europe, and the Middle East. And many of you will know that Asher is, or has been for many, many years, one of Israel's leading scholars on the Palestinians and on Jordan. And it's an opportune moment that he can be with us. He's just released a brand new book entitled Jordan, Palestine, and the Politics of Collective Identity. And I anticipate that he will be drawing from that and from his many years of both observing and being a participant in the affairs that engage Jordan in the Middle East, and in particular with Israel, and in the context of the Palestinians and the future of regional security. As you will know, Asher has been a distinguished professor of contemporary Middle East history at Tel Aviv University, and served, if my memory is correct, 3 terms as director of the Moshe Dayan Center of Middle East and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. And with that, Asher, it's always a pleasure to welcome you back. It's good that we have the opportunity to share your insights and wisdom on a regular basis. So thank you, and the screen's yours.
Well, thank you very much, David, for your very kind introduction. What I will be trying to do today is to give an overview, a historical overview of the Jordanian Israeli-Palestinian relationship, going through 4 segments. The first will be from containment to disengagement, the effort by Jordan at first to contain Palestine and then subsequently coming to the conclusion that it would be better to disengage. The second topic would be the peace treaty and its outcome, what the Jordanians expected from it and what they actually got. 3 is the Gaza war and its implications for the Jordanian Israeli-Palestinian relationship. And 4th, the Trump election and how this is seen in the region, especially from the Jordanian angle at present. So starting off with from containment to disengagement, it has been said of Israel and Jordan in the early years that they were the best of enemies. And a book was indeed written by an Israeli author about the 1948 war, the title of which was The Best of Enemies. And I think it's a very apt description of what the Israeli-Jordanian relationship was, and in some respects still remains so, but far less. The best of enemies meant that Israel and Jordan had common cause on the issue of Palestine, but at the same time went to war with each other in 1948 and fought some of the most bitter battles of that war were actually between the Israelis and the Jordanians. But they had common cause, and the common cause was the shared fear and antipathy of both the Jordanians and the Israelis towards the emerging Palestinian national movement. The Jordanians were at loggerheads with the Palestinians from the very outset of the British Mandate. The Jordanians accepted the British Mandate, the Palestinians didn't. And the Jordanians generally had a shared view with Israel about the potential hostility of the Palestinian National Movement led by Haj Amin al-Husseini that would not only be against the Zionists, but would be against the Jordanians on the other side of the river as well. Therefore, at the end of the war of 1948, it was agreeable to the Israelis and to the Jordanians that what was left of Arab Palestine, or the major section of what was left of Arab Palestine, that is what came to be known as the West Bank, would become part of the Kingdom of Jordan. And Jordan annexed the West Bank with Israeli acquiescence, and the small snippet of the Gaza Strip became a territory occupied by the Egyptian military, and Palestine was removed from the geographical map. There was no place called Palestine after the war of 1948. It was the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and the rest was Israel. In fact, even calling the West Bank was a way of de-Palestinizing it. After all, the Jordanians could have called it Palestine. And they could have maintained the name Palestine for the West Bank, but didn't. So the West Bank became an appendage of the East Bank to be Jordanized, to become part of the Jordanian kingdom. And only two countries gave full citizenship to their Palestinian citizens, Israel and Jordan. And they both did it for the same reason. They had no interest in the preservation of a distinct Palestinian identity. So this is the containment. Israel and Jordan together will contain Palestine between them. That was, from their point of view, the ideal solution for their respective Palestinian problems. These were the 1950s and the 1960s. One should recall the heady days of Arab nationalism. Abdel Nasser was the man of the time. And the idea of a separate Jordanian nationalism or a separate Palestinian nationalism was not part of the discourse. And the Jordanians did not promote a particular Jordanian identity, and the Palestinians were rather slow in preserving or reviving a Palestinian identity of their own. This did begin some years before the Six-Day War. And the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, was established, as we know, in 1964. But it's 1967 that is the turning point of the story. 1967 was the overturning of the regional architecture that was the result of the 1948 war. The West Bank was no longer occupied by Jordan, was no longer part of the Jordanian kingdom in practical terms, and it became the Israeli-occupied West Bank. This set Palestinian nationalism on an entirely different and far more independent course. The occupation became the objective to be removed by this revived Palestinian national movement. In 1967, and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank is the accelerating tool of Palestinian nationalism in the aftermath of the 1967 war, and the beginning in real terms of what the Palestinians called the armed struggle. And the armed struggle was now focused on the liberation of Palestine, the liberation of the occupation, and in the long run, as the PLO had it in those days, the liberation of all of Palestine. But the armed struggle didn't only work against Israel. The armed struggle also worked against Jordan. The Israelis did not allow the armed struggle to take place in the West Bank, and the Palestinian fighters were pushed out to the East Bank, and eventually they became a huge nuisance, if not to say a state within a state, in Jordan itself. The Palestinian fighting forces were eventually pushed away from the border with Israel by Israeli retaliation, and they ended up controlling the Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan. that became these extraterritorial Palestinian units inside the Jordanian kingdom. This is the background to the very well-known civil war between the Jordanians and the Palestinians, 1970, Black September. Black September, however, is a very important chapter, not in Jordan containing Palestine, but in Jordan fighting Palestine. It's now Jordan versus Palestinians. And this is the beginning of a shift whereby Jordanian nationalism becomes a product and a project of the Jordanian state as it had never been before. And Jordanianness is deliberately promoted by the state and by the East Bank Jordanians as their focus of identity versus the ultimate other, the Palestinians. So it's now Jordan versus Palestine, Jordanianness versus Palestinianness. It's no longer the containment, but the competition. We're now in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, Israel takes a turn in its domestic politics, the rise of the right in Israeli politics. The Likud comes to power in Israel in 1977. This is a radical turning point for the Jordanians. After all, they for decades had been in cooperation with the Israeli Labour Party in the partitioning of Palestine between them. It is between them that they partitioned Palestine in 1948, and it is subsequent to 1967 that the Israelis spoke of the Jordanian option, that is, they will return much of the West Bank to Jordan, which wasn't good enough for the Jordanians, but it was still talking about Jordan as the major party to partition Palestine with Israel. Not an independent Palestinian state, but Jordan resuming its major role in the containment of Palestine. But with the right wing in power in Israel, you have a party in power that has no intention of partitioning Palestine with anybody. So if the Likud coming to power in 1977 was initially seen by King Hussein and by many others also in Israel too as some kind of socio-political accident, the fact that Begin and the Likud won the elections again in 1981 was an indication to Hussein, to the Jordanians, and to everybody else that Israel was changing. 1977 was not an accident. It was the beginning of a radical change and shift to the right in Israeli politics. Now the Jordanians have to ask themselves, if Israel is in the hands of the right, who believe that all of historical Eretz Israel belongs to the Jews, and they have no intention of partitioning it with anyone, what are these Israelis going to do with the Palestinians? There are those on the Israeli right who say the solution to Israel's Palestinian problem is to turn Jordan into Palestine. And Jordan is Palestine. And Jordan was initially part of the British mandate over Palestine. Jordan is Palestine. There is a Palestinian majority in Jordan. And there probably is a Palestinian majority, not nearly as big as people in the right tend to say. People talk about 70 to 80% Palestinians in Jordan. That's probably very incorrect. But there probably are more than 50, somewhere between 50 and 60%. So Jordan is Palestine. So it's no longer the idea of Israel partitioning Palestine with Jordan in some kind of arrangement, but rather the Israeli right possessing a vision for the solution to their Palestinian problem that comes at the expense of Jordan in what the Jordanians call the alternative homeland. The alternative homeland is this idea of transforming the kingdom of Jordan into the homeland for the Palestinians, and therefore the solution to Palestine is at Jordan's expense. So if the king had argued, King Hussein had argued for decades, that Jordan is Palestine and Palestine is Jordan, and there's no need for the PLO, and Jordan will solve the Palestinian question with Israel, and most of the Palestinians are Jordanian citizens anyway, and Jordan is the party to solve the Palestinian question, the Jordanians are beginning to think entirely differently in the 1980s. Jordan is not Palestine. Jordan is Jordan, and Palestine is Palestine. And the solution to the Palestinian question must be found in Palestine, not in Jordan at the kingdom's expense, but the two-state solution. And Jordan becomes probably the most anxious and active in the promotion of the two-state idea. And the disengagement of Jordan from the West Bank. Jordan is not Palestine. Therefore, the 1988 decision coming after the outbreak of the first Palestinian uprising, the Intifada, which the Jordanians feared could turn into an Israeli expulsion of Palestinians to Jordan. In order to solve the problem of the uprising, the Israelis may expel masses of Palestinians to Jordan to solve the Palestinian question in Jordan and to keep the West Bank for Israel. Thus, the Jordanian decision in 1988 to disengage from the West Bank. The West Bank is not Jordan anymore. Don't dump the West Bankers on Jordan. They are not Jordanians. And from a certain date, the 31st of August 1988, all the Palestinians in the West Bank are not Jordanian citizens anymore. So Jordan, instead of containing Palestine, which is seen from the rise of the right in Israel to be potentially very dangerous for Jordan itself, Jordan is disengaging from Palestine. Jordan is Jordan, Palestine is Palestine. That is the logic of the peace treaty from the Jordanian point of view. That is the number one achievement for Jordan in signing the peace treaty with Israel in 1994. Having signed their agreement with Israel, the PLO, Jordan was now free to sign its own agreement with Israel without being accused of treason and avoiding support for the Palestinians. The Palestinians have made their agreement with Israel. Jordan is making its agreement with Israel. And the agreement with Israel is based on the achievement of a two-state solution. Now the containment meant not the annexation of the West Bank by Jordan, but the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza to be contained by Israel and Jordan in their strategic political cooperation, not by Jordanian annexation. This is the understanding between Peres, between Rabin and Hussein. And after the peace treaty, for the Jordanians, the main achievement is the end of this idea of the alternative homeland. Israel has finally recognized Jordan's borders, and the association with Israel, the peace with Israel, will extricate Jordan from its perennial economic difficulties. So you'll have Jordan promised as Jordan, Palestine is Palestine, and the fruits of peace will solve Jordan's economic problems, and the region will enjoy regional peace and quiet and order. None of that came to pass. None of the Jordanian expectations from the peace treaty ever came to pass. Rabin was assassinated. The second Intifada exploded in the year 2000. Oslo and the Palestinian state never emerged. And the peace that was supposed to provide Jordan with a revitalized economy didn't happen either. The region, this time having nothing to do with Israel, certainly didn't meet the expectations of regional order, but it was complete regional disorder. from the breakup of Iraq to the Arab Spring, etc. The breakup of the regional order, not Israel's fault in this case, but nevertheless part of the undoing of the Jordanian vision of what the peace was supposed to look like. So this is the background to the war in Gaza. When the war in Gaza explodes, the Jordanians say, well, you see, this is what happens when there is no peace process, when the two-state solution doesn't come to pass. What can one expect the Palestinians to choose when they have no peace horizon? There is no two-state solution. And Israel's actions in Gaza, the movement of the population here and there, back and forth, gives rise to the worst of Jordan's fears that had never really passed. Israel is going to annex the territories, and there is this discourse of annexation, which is part and parcel of what has been going on in Israel since the 7th of October, the dismissal in Israel of the two-state idea, Jordan's fears of annexation and expulsion. What the Israelis have in mind, they will tell you, and it's not that Israelis never said things of the kind. They will expel Gazans to Egypt, and they will expel people from the West Bank to Jordan. The Jordanians made it very clear in public statements immediately after the war that expulsion would be seen as an act of war, would be seen as an infringement of the peace treaty. And indeed, if you look at the peace treaty, there are two components of the peace treaty. One is particularly for Jordan's sake, and the other is particularly for Israel's sake. The treaty commits both parties not to allow the stationing of hostile foreign forces on their soil. I call that the Iraqi clause. That is to keep Iraq out of Jordan and to keep other powers from the region out of Jordanian territory, to preserve Jordan as Israel's buffer to the east. That's a very important component for Israel's sake in the Jordanian treaty. For the Jordanians, there is a clause which specifically prohibits the involuntary movement of population. That is, no expulsions of Palestinians to Jordan. Therefore, any talk of expulsion, any talk of movement of Palestinians to Jordan, the Jordanians can say with justification that this flies in the face of a specific commitment in the peace treaty. So Israel's relationship with Jordan has two distinct dimensions, contradictory to each other, which operate at one and the same time. On the one hand, Israel and Jordan cooperate strategically in terms of regional defense. Israel assists Jordan in preserving its stability versus the neighborhood. Israel certainly has an interest in Jordanian stability, in keeping Iran out of Jordan, in preventing Iranian subversion in Jordan. And the Jordanians have been very active in actually protecting Israel against Iran and missile attacks coming from Iran. We know that on both occasions that the Iranians engaged in this activity, the Jordanians were active in Israel's defense together with other allies associated with the United States. One can also suspect, with I think considerable foundation, that the Jordanians are not displeased with the dismantling of Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is an enemy of the regime. The Muslim Brethren are hostile to the regime in Jordan. And I doubt very much whether the regime is upset, particularly by the dismantling of Hamas. But they are very upset by the destruction of Gaza and its people. And the population in Jordan, Palestinians and Jordanians alike, from the bottom to the royal family, are deeply disturbed by the destruction in Gaza. The political dismantling of Hamas is one thing, but the human suffering of the Palestinians is another, with which the Jordanians from top to bottom identify very strongly and obviously are extremely critical of Israel in this respect. But Israel is also seen as a threat. On the one hand, Israel is a regional collaborator, a regional ally in terms of who Israel's friends in the region are and who Jordan's friends in the region are, and in there they're on the same page. But Israel's opposition to the two-state solution, Israel's annexationist statements and actions in recent months, gives rise to the worst of Jordanian fears, for which they initially, if you recall, they signed the peace treaty. The peace treaty was to take the Jordan-Palestine equation off the table forever. And it is still there. And the Jordanians will say to you, people who were on the margins of Israeli politics years ago and who counted for nothing in Israeli politics a few decades ago, are key ministers in the Israeli government of today. So on the one hand, Israel is a regional ally. But at one and the same time, it is a serious threat to Jordanian national security, as it is seen by the Jordanians. The Jordanians may be exaggerating, and maybe they are exaggerating the threat. But whether they're exaggerating or not makes no difference to the fact that this is what they really believe, and behave accordingly. And this is endangering the essence of the treaty in the long run. There is, of course, the issue of Jerusalem, which is not only an issue of Hashemite prestige in terms of the Hashemite heritage, but also in the eyes of the Jordanian leadership, including the king. The fear that Jerusalem will be the point of ignition of a massive regional crisis between Israel and the Palestinians, and result in a movement of population expulsion, call it whatever you wish. And therefore, Jerusalem is this issue of extreme sensitivity, not only because of its religious importance and its importance to the Hashemites as the custodians of the holy places, but again, directly related to Jordanian national security. Now, Israelis will often say, well, the king has to say X, Y, Z because of his Palestinian population. That is partly true, but it's only half the story. Much of what the king says about his fears and about what is happening in Gaza and the fear of Jordan-Palestine is not about pacifying the Jordanian population. It's a reflection of the fears of the political establishment up to the level of the palace. It is their genuine fears for their stability, their political security. It's not just about pacifying the population. Now, the Trump election. You see the Trump election. You see the people who he's appointing as his senior ministers of his cabinet, the ambassador to Israel. These are all supporters of annexationism of one kind or another. For the Jordanians, this is really bad news. This is going back to Trump's deal of the century, as it was called at the time, and perhaps even worse. Again, the specter of annexation and what the Jordanians see as an essential component of annexation, which is pushing the Palestinian population out, or much of it. So anxiety in Jordan is, I would say, on the uptake. And the Jordanians must be very concerned with what is happening in the United States. So what are the conclusions? Again, my friend Marwan Moasher gives an interview and says Jordan should give up the two-state solution. Jordan, the main supporter of the two-state solution, well, even more enthusiastic about a two-state solution than the Palestinians ever were. Moasher saying there is a one-state reality which is coming into being. The two-state solution is becoming increasingly unrealistic. Jordan has fears to fear and problems to expect. Therefore, we, the Jordanians, must establish what Marwan calls a rights-based approach. That is not a two-state solution, but a one-state solution based on equal rights for all. And we should now move away from the two-state paradigm to a one-state paradigm, in which we will not be talking about states, but we will be talking about rights. There'll be a one-state reality, in which at present Marwan points out the Arabs are the majority. 7.5 million Arabs between the Mediterranean and the sea, to some 7.3 Jews. That's including the Arab population of Israel and the population of Gaza and the population of the West Bank, altogether somewhere around 7.5 million. And the Israelis close to that, but slightly less. But the trend, birth rates, emigration, will probably increase the gap between the Palestinians and the Jews in this population structure of all of historical Palestine. So if people like Moasher are beginning to talk about a one-state solution, it's going to become increasingly difficult to portray the two-state solution as the basis for the peace process as we move forward if Jordan backs away from it. Maybe this is just a tactical maneuver, but it is a sign of the times where if the Israelis think that pushing for annexation is going to be a walk in the park, this is probably not going to be so. And this is probably a recipe for escalation of conflict rather than anything else. I will conclude by saying that I don't think much of a one-state solution, I must say. To speak of a one-state solution in the aftermath of the 7th of October, to me seems like an idea which is completely off the wall. However, many would say that with the present positions on both sides, and especially the position being taken by Israel and the government of Israel, the two-state solution is as much as a pie in the sky, just as any other. So I leave you with those thoughts in mind, and gladly take your questions on all that we have discussed. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. You've covered a lot of information, both background and analysis, and I expect a lot of material that is new to our listeners and to those of us on the panel. Let me see first if our colleague Jasmine Habib wants to ask anything, because I know Jasmine, you have to leave earlier. Yeah, you're still on mute, Jasmine.
Sorry about that. I actually have to leave right now, but I wanted to thank Ashraf for his presentation. I did have one question about the one state, which you've already actually articulated in the sense that you don't believe it's any more of a reality coming into being than a two-state possibility. I guess part of the question, one of the questions I would have is to what extent are we seeing, to what extent is what's happened in Gaza likely to also happen in the West Bank? I mean, I think the West Bank has institutions that are very, very strong as compared to certainly Gaza, and Gaza, of course, is under siege and under Hamas. So could you say maybe something about what that might look like if not just the annexation with respect to dispossession of Palestinian lands, which is happening right now, but what might it even look like if we were to think about it from a military or security perspective? This sounds doomsday to me, but I do think we need to think about it. So thank you.
Well, I don't think, at least it seems to me just to be a horrific thought to make any comparison between the West Bank and Gaza. And I don't see this happening in the West Bank. What happened in Gaza is, of course, not only due to what Israel has done there over the last year or so, but due to the 7th of October, which had a lot to do with Hamas and the way Hamas turned Gaza into this rocket base, which hasn't happened in the West Bank and will not happen in the West Bank, simply because Israel is already there. But I would say the critical problem with the Israeli policy is not turning the West Bank into Gaza, which I don't think is a possibility, but emasculating the Palestinian Authority and turning the West Bank into an area that has no government other than the Israeli military occupation. So the West Bank will turn more and more into an area perhaps of parts of Israeli annexation and other parts of Israeli occupation, which are going to be unworkable. And this is not going to pass any test of any international community. And I don't even see a Trump administration being able to settle the kind of difficulties that will emerge from this. And that's why I don't think, one of the things that the Jordanians are saying, at least Marwan Moasham, says, well, we already have a one-state reality. So if we don't have anything near a two-state reality, but we have a one-state reality which we can improve. And we can turn this into a one-state reality based on the rights, the struggle for rights. This is an apartheid situation, and we will make this a struggle for rights. This is what Marwan is talking about. The problem with why I say the one-state reality is unrealistic is that you need a measure of communal agreement for a one-state reality to turn into something humane. People make the comparison with South Africa. Well, in South Africa, there was a communal agreement. And the new regime in South Africa is based on an agreement. You have no agreement in Israel and nowhere near approaching anything like an agreement in Israel. And what can happen from a one-state reality can look like a war of all against all, with the Palestinians having the demographic advantage and the Israelis having the advantage of power. And that is not going to look good. It will look a lot worse than what the West Bank looks like today. So I hope we never get there. And the only realistic way of creating something that is livable, I would say, is eventually finding the way back to a two-state solution. Now, I'll just add one other point, and that is, there's a fellow in Israel by the name of Shaul Arieli. And Shaul Arieli writes regularly in Haaretz once a week, once every 2 weeks. And the articles keep on saying more or less the same thing. That it is wrong to believe that the two-state solution is unrealistic because of the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is far less Israeli control than people think. And the Israeli settlement project in the West Bank is far less concrete than people seem to imagine. He shows that a very high percentage of the settlers are on the border area with old Israel and are ultra-Orthodox, not settler militants, and who are more capable of reaching some kind of understanding and agreement than the settler militants who are in the news all the time. So I think too little of the problems of a potential one-state reality are taken into account, and the two-state difficulties are overstated. So I still think that at the end of the day, the two-state idea, I hesitate to say two-state solution. And I'd rather say creating a two-state reality rather than the one-state reality. I don't think we can find something that we could really call a solution, but something that both parties can live with, more or less in peace, for an extended period of time. And I think that is possible. The government in Israel has to change in order to achieve that, just as much as you have to have on the Palestinian side a different leadership. And all of that is all very theoretical, but I still think that is the only avenue to realistically pursue. I don't think the one-state idea is at all achievable.
I'll just ask one other question though, before I leave, because that's very helpful, Ashel. I mean, I think that from the Palestinian perspective, a rights-oriented, a rights approach actually makes sense given the kinds of allies, not allies, that exist in the region. And so I wonder then what the international community's response may be to a rights-based approach rather than a states-based approach, if you understand what I'm saying.
Well, I think, first of all, I think to put things as they really are, a rights-based approach means in the end the creation of some kind of one state between the river and the sea, which means that Israel is not going to be there. The Jewish state of Israel is not going to be in this one-state reality. And therefore, I think the Jews of Israel are going to be, even the most liberal of Jews in Israel, are going to be very unlikely to support this idea. Whereas from the Palestinian point of view, it makes enormous sense more as the days go by, because the Palestinian majority between the river and the sea is going to increase. And once they are a stable majority in the region, why should they agree to partition? We're going back to the pre-48 period. It's a reversion to the pre-48 period when the Palestinians said, well, why should we partition Palestine? We are the majority. We deserve the right to self-determination as the majority. The Jews can have minority rights. And if they don't like it, they can go and look somewhere else. This is going to be what is, and this is where I think the Israeli government at present is completely blind to the reality. They are walking into the worst of possibilities for Israel with both eyes open. And they are leading Israel to what will be, I think, a tragic outcome for the Israeli project. And therefore, when Marwan says the Israeli project is dying, this is what Marwan thinks. And this is what he has in mind. Not because Marwan is evil, but Marwan just sees what he thinks is the reality. And Marwan spells it out in this interview. He says very interesting things. He says the Israeli project is dying. What he means when he spells it out is that Israel was supposed to be a secular, democratic, national, modern state. And he says it's not that anymore. It may have been once, it's not that anymore. It's becoming something else altogether, neither secular, nor national, nor democratic. So what's left of the Israeli project? And this is, I think, where Netanyahu and co. are doing Israel and the Zionist idea a horrific historical disservice. And I'll say one other thing, and here, Zionism and its international legitimacy was always based on partition. Zionism was never accorded, even in the Balfour Declaration, all of Palestine. Even the Balfour Declaration never gave all of Palestine to the Jews. It spoke about the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, not the conversion of Palestine into. And therefore, the moment Israel abandons the idea of partition, Israel is abandoning its international legitimacy. It's cutting off the branch on which it sits. And this is another thing that the right in Israel has no perception of. And by doing both of these things, by rejecting the idea of partition and by bowling over the Palestinian national movement and engaging in the kind of annexationism, Israel is delegitimizing itself.
Thank you, Asher, very much. I need to run. I'm so sorry, but I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
You're on mute, David, but I hear you're saying that I can speak. Okay. Just on that last point, Asher, I'm just going to provide sort of a devil's advocate position. Israel, irrespective of one state or two states, is not going away. That's what the Israeli people and the Israeli government think. It's not going away. It has nuclear powers. It has the 7th largest army in the world. Secondly, so if it stops being a secular democratic national state, too bad. That's exactly what the Messianic ministers want. And it'll be just like every other state in the region. They're not liberal. They're not democratic. So it's not the Israel that we knew and loved, but that's going to be the new reality. That's what they have to live with. And most Israelis right now don't care what the international community thinks. They certainly don't care what the UN thinks. The only country they care about really is the United States. And for quite a while, the United States is going to support whatever Israel does. I'm just posing this as, I'm posing this as in opposition to what? The United States still sees Israel as the only ally in the region, whether it's democratic or not democratic. Okay, we don't share values anymore, but we still share interests. And vis-a-vis Iran and the others, c'est la vie. So I just posed that. Just a couple of other things. I'd be interested in your views on the Egyptian Gaza side of the border. Is Israel also going to try and push the Palestinians in Gaza out of Gaza and into Egypt? I suggest that might be a harder proposition, but depending on what they want to do. Finally, I just ask you, what is the difference? You just said, I don't want to talk about a two-state solution. I want to talk about a two-state reality. What is the difference between those two? Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, I'll start from the end, if I may. A two-state reality as opposed to a two-state solution is a two-state reality in which both parties don't accept all of it. Not everything is agreed. There are things that remain in perpetual disagreement. But, for example, the refugees. We're not going to solve the refugee problem. But we may be able to live with it for decades to come, and both sides will be dissatisfied with this or that, and it will be maybe like the relationship we have with Syria. Not everything is resolved, but we live in peace with each other more or less. That's what I mean by reality versus a solution. Where not everything is agreed. There are things that we just don't agree upon and never will. When it comes to, c'est la vie, let it be, Israel undemocratic, I think it's perfectly realistic for that reality to prevail for a year, 2, 3, 4, 5, but that's it. This is not a 25-year project of Israel as some kind of I don't know, Hungary. Too many people who are absolutely necessary for the survival of the state of Israel won't remain there. And Israel will gradually become an underdeveloped backwater, maybe become more similar to the kind of Jewish existence that existed in Palestine in the Ottoman Empire, where there were Jews who lived in Palestine, in what wasn't yet called Palestine, but nevertheless the Holy Land, and they lived off handouts from the Jews of the world. And that the project of Jewish sovereignty simply will fade away. Nobody will declare anything. And you won't have to have, a victory parade of any sort. Simply Israel will gradually dissolve into this larger Arab state, simply by virtue of population and numbers. And the nature of the Israeli state, Israel won't be, cannot be, in those circumstances, a startup nation. And it won't have the 7th largest army in the world. I don't know what kind of army it will have at all. Who is going to serve in the 7th largest army in the world? Who will remain in this kind of Israel to serve in this army? Even now the army is having difficulties having people serve in the reserve for 300 days a year. So this, I don't think it's a realistic project. One could say, okay, so Israel will be like some God-forsaken country somewhere in the third world, but Israel cannot survive as such a country. And even the Jews of the world will eventually turn against it and become bored with this country of their backward relatives that they won't enjoy. So I don't think Israel of that nature has a future. And it won't be because someone will declare that it has been undone. It will simply undo itself. It will simply gradually dissolve. And it just won't be there anymore. And this will take X number of years, but I don't think it will remain. And I think the people who are now, the people we spoke about earlier, about people emigrating from Israel these days, you will find some of them saying that they don't think Israel has a future. And that's why they're leaving. Not because they're looking for a better proposition in the US or looking for a better livelihood or, teaching their kids English. They don't see Israel having a future. And I think this is the question, the bigger question, and this is the question that Netanyahu and company have to address. This war is going to end at some time, hopefully sooner rather than later. And the questions that will be on Israel's table are these. And if Netanyahu and company can't come up with some satisfactory result about what Israel is becoming, these people who are leaving Israel these days, I can imagine that the great majority of them come from the liberal left, who also happen to be the backbone of the country in terms of its intelligentsia, even the military. The military is one of the most liberal institutions in Israel, or at least still is, maybe changing gradually. But I think there's something that I missed in what you asked.
Egypt and what's going to happen to the Palestinians there?
Egypt and Jordan are not the same. And they're not the same for the simple reason that Egypt is the great military power, that Israel will be far more reluctant to mess with than it would with Jordan. Secondly, I would say the major territorial asset is the West Bank and not Gaza. And therefore, for both these reasons, there's more of a likelihood that the Israelis may wish to push out the population from the West Bank rather than Gaza. And Gaza, we already know from the Egyptian point of view, is an absolute no-no. And I cannot see Israel picking a fight with Egypt on that. And I don't see Israel picking a fight with Jordan either. But there'd be less inclination on the Israeli side to avoid picking a fight with Jordan than there would be with Egypt.
Mark.
Thank you, David. Usher, once again, thank you so much for your important analysis, and you always bring new information and new learnings to what are these critical issues. Last week, we had as our guest Professor Limor Yehuda, who has written about and is very involved in the movement for a confederation approach to the issues with Israel and Palestinians. Could we get your comments on what you think about the confederation idea?
Yeah, the confederation idea has been around for a long time, and it really is an effort to try and circumvent the problems that arise from the two-state idea. The problem is, I would say the number one problem with the confederation idea is that if there existed even 1/10 of the mutual trust that is required to create a confederation, we would have had a two-state solution 50 years ago. There's no trust, not in the minimal amount. And a confederation or a federation is much more complicated than a two-state idea. The two-state idea, as I said, we can live even with not resolving all the problems, and we can call it a two-state reality rather than a two-state solution. A confederation, how are we going to resolve the issue of the Secret Service? How are we going to resolve the issue of foreign policy, settlement policy, anything? Can one imagine the Mossad and Hamas sitting together to formulate the security arrangements for this confederative state? I mean, this is, it's much more complicated. The two-state solution is the most simple. It's a clear-cut divorce. Whereas a confederation has all the complexities of the divorce, plus all the complexities of continuing to live in the same house. We've got apart. And even the two-state solution is, I don't think, achievable, and therefore I speak of less than a solution. I don't see the confederation as less complicated. It's more complicated. We're going to have a common border, and the Israelis and Palestinians are going to move between these two states and freely. I mean, how is all this going to work? I've never seen any idea of confederation that has ever brought about more agreement than the negotiations over two states. The Palestinians will tell you the confederation idea is a way of leaving the settlements where they are, and we don't want them. And it's just an Israeli idea to avoid the Israelis avoiding the terrible problem that the Israelis have with removing the settlements. So let's have Arabs living in Israel and Jews living in Palestine. We'll call it a confederation, and we won't have to remove the settlements. Well, the Palestinians don't buy that. And the settlement issue is one of the key problems that a confederation is supposed to solve. And that's where it's going to explode. Why should the Palestinians agree to settlements in Palestine? Other than solving Israeli problems for the Israelis.
Let me follow up then. Okay, that confederation, not a reality from your perspective. Two-state solution, more of a reality. What does that mean for the settlements beyond the settlement blocks in your view? Do they get?
They've got to go. They've got to go. No question about it. And if they don't go, there won't be any settlement. And this is all, the whole settlement project is the biggest mistake the Zionists have ever made in their entire history. And it has to go. In more years than the entire British mandate. We have been in occupation of the West Bank for nearly 60 years. That is much longer than the British mandate. We have less settlers in the West Bank than we established in the British mandate. We did better under the British than we've done under our own government. The settlers are something like 13 to 14% of the population in the West Bank. It's not including Jerusalem. Under the British mandate, we were a third of the population. 600,000 people. We don't have 600,000 settlers in the West Bank yet. In 60 years, not almost. It's not a project that the Israeli public is for. And most of the settlements are points on the map that have a few hundred people, religious extremists of various kinds, who have, through coalition politics, are holding the entire Israeli public to ransom for an idea which I think is completely deranged and destructive to the long-term cause of Israel.
Sure. I think most of us in this webinar would agree that a change of government, as you've indicated, is what's required. Do you envision that if a change of government were to take place after the next election, that there would be plans and a movement towards the removal of these settlements in due course?
I'm really not sure about that, because any government that will replace the present one will be a coalition of sorts that will include elements of the right. I don't think it will be possible to form a government in Israel that doesn't include elements of the right, and who will be opposed to this. But I think it also depends on how people begin to envisage the settlement project in the years ahead. Is there a point where people begin to understand and to reject the settlement idea? That would have to be part of the Israeli discourse seriously before anything like this could happen. And I'm not sure that it is possible. But if the settlements beyond the blocks are not removed, I don't think there will be a solution, and I think it will only reinforce those trends that are leading to Israel's undoing.
Thank you. David, back to you.
Usher, before I turn to a couple of questions that are in the Q&A, and others who are viewing, if they have questions, please submit them to the Q&A. Let me ask you a question about Jordan specifically. What leverage, if any, could they bring to the table to affect policy? Is it what are their opportunities to be in control of their future, given the overwhelming military strength of Israel, and so long as there is a right-wing government that sees expansion as a distinct possibility?
I think that the only realistic leverage that they have is related to the peace treaty. That is, the peace treaty can include a lot, and it can include less. I could see the Jordanians, for example, eventually cutting diplomatic relations with Israel, closing their embassy, having us close our embassy. I don't think they'll abolish the treaty, but they could do very many things in order to gradually empty the treaty of content. Marwan Moasher, in this interview that I was talking about, or in some other piece he wrote, spoke about the treaty collecting dust. That the treaty is just collecting dust, as if the treaty has no real content. There are many things that Israel and Jordan do together, and some of them are very difficult for the Jordanians to change, because the Jordanians are dependent on Israel's goodwill, let's say, for water and energy. And then they can't play with that. But they could, of course, make things difficult on Jerusalem. But I would say, give Israel the message that the peace treaty is not to be taken for granted, and to find ways and means of doing just that. And I think they will. And I think they're already halfway there. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if in the very near future, we hear of, actions by the Jordanians of this nature, of lowering the level of diplomatic representation or having no diplomatic representation at all, and asking Israel to shut the embassy. and not to go to war, but not to have peace either. And we are pushing them in that direction. We are, by ignoring what it is that they're telling us, we are making life very difficult for them and for the position of the government and the position of the general public merging together. It's not as if the general public are against the treaty that the government dramatically supports. The government is fed up with the Israelis also. And I think the position of the popular mood and the official position are moving closer together. And if you listen to what the king has to say, or the foreign minister, or at times the queen, who doesn't speak a lot, but when she does, she says the most horrific things about Israel. We are creating a situation where the regime, the palace, the government, and the popular mood are in the same place.
But does that concern the current Israeli government?
I don't think they really notice. I don't think they really notice.
Then,
and I once spoke at an institute and explained part of this, and they thought that I was exaggerating, as if the treaty was not in danger and the Jordanians were saying nothing of the kind, but they are. And as I say, there is a tendency to take them for granted. And I don't think the Israeli government really, I don't think they see it.
But if the treaty is possibly in danger, a right-wing Israeli government, of what cost would they perceive that to be? Is it of a strategic concern, even if it became evident that this is the direction that the palace and the people of Jordan are going? Why would an Israel of the current tenor it is care? How does it make it? I can imagine how it makes it more strategically vulnerable if they really envisioned a regional security and economic cooperation regime. But if they don't envision that, then good or bad relations, treaty or no relations with Jordan, what difference would it make to an Israeli government?
Well, I think you have to, split this into two. I think the Smotriches and the Ben-Gvirs maybe would even see this as a blessing in disguise. To hell with the Jordanians. So we'll do what we like vis-a-vis the Jordanians. I can't see Netanyahu taking a position like that. And definitely I wouldn't see the military establishment taking a position like that. And the extremists would have to justify the position they're taking to, I would say, the greater part of the Israeli government, and certainly the entire part of the Israeli defense establishment, which I think is already speaking up about the importance of Jordan more than the government is. But I think that they would have a lot to say. They would have a lot to say. And I think, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir may be able to do a lot. But there are certain things that even now they cannot do. And I don't think that they would be able to justify a position that endangers the relationship with Jordan. I mean, we've got enough on our plate without having to bring the Jordanian front into being as an active front that we have to spend forces and energy to protect Israel. So I think it would be difficult for them to do that. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Jordanians began to make noises like Marwan Muasher is already making. That this is an intolerable situation from the Jordanian point of view, and it is endangering the peace treaty. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we would hear talk like that coming from the king and from others in Jordan very soon.
So here is a question from someone in the audience. It's a sharp question. Why is it okay for Jordan to expect Israel to solve the Palestinian solution and wash their hands of the Palestinians?
It's a question where essentially Israel and Jordan are trying, each one, to place the onus of solving the Palestinian question on the other. Israel of the right would like the Jordanians to be the solution, and the Jordanian right would like Israel to be the solution. What kind of neighbor do we expect to have if Jordan becomes Palestine? Do we really think that if Jordan were to become Palestine, Jordan would be the kind of strategic ally that we have had for the last few decades? We will be taking the only country, the only Arab state that actually has an interest in Israel's existence and overturning it. And turning it into a country that has every desire to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And this state of Palestine on the other side of the river will become the #1 henchman for Iran and the others in their ring of fire to continue the war against Israel. Why do that? Why should Israel do that? It would seem, at least to say the least, an odd choice for Israel to remove the only state that has anything in favor of Israel's long-term existence removed. And removed by a player which has absolutely no interest in Israel's existence. The Palestinians couldn't care less if Israel wasn't there in a week's time. And turning Jordan into this launching pad for the Palestinian struggle against Israel, which is what it would become, is not in Israel's interest. The idea that the Palestinians, if Jordan would be turned into a Palestinian state, the Palestinians would have a state and the world would get off Israel's back, and the Palestinians therefore would be satisfied, are based on a false assumption. And the false assumption is that the Palestinians are fighting Israel because they don't have a state. That's not the reason why they're fighting Israel. The Palestinians are fighting Israel because Israel has a state. And by turning Jordan into the Palestinian launching pad, it will only be more convenient for them to wage their struggle against the Israeli state, which they have been waging for a long time. So I don't see how this serves Israel's cause. And that's why Israel hasn't done it. And it has had opportunities to do it. Black September in 1970 was an opportunity. And Israel did all it could then in Black September to save the Jordanians from their enemies rather than otherwise, precisely for that reason. And we have no neighbor that has been as let's say, cooperative and as convenient for Israel as Jordan has been. And therefore, no reason to change them with someone not reliable in the slightest. What do we want the kingdom of Hamas to be on the other side of the river? I mean, that is what would emerge.
So
What would emerge in Jordan would be Gaza 15 times over. Why should we do that?
Mark, unless you have one last question, I'll have one before we.
Sure. Go ahead, David. Yeah.
So perhaps you can enlighten us on the extent to which below the rhetoric of politicians, there is an ongoing working relationship between Israel and Jordan. My understanding had been that in quieter times, there had been the development and strength of diplomatic relations, people-to-people relations, and that's security, information, intelligence sharing, understanding, a working relationship between militaries, meetings either bilaterally or outside the region. There had been a growing weaving of a kind of a tapestry of relations at the working level. To what extent has that been torn asunder? Or is that still ongoing even in the midst of these difficult and uncertain political times?
No, I think much of that is ongoing, particularly in the defense sphere. Not so much people to people. There's not much of that going on. There's not much in terms of trade other than the water and the energy issue, which is of strategic importance for Jordan. Security is, I think, at a very high level of cooperation. The publics on both sides know very little about it because it is security. So what the good that does take place is not publicized. And you see everything that is not happening publicized all over the place. So that element does exist and continues to work pretty well. And this is exactly the contradiction, where you have this element of genuine cooperation between the militaries and intelligence sharing and the struggle against Iran, etc. That is really there. But all the other connections and the relationship between the establishments on both sides are I would say, very difficult. I don't think the king and Netanyahu talk to each other at all, or haven't spoken to each other for a long time, and there's not much going on between them. And this is where I say the relationship is it's a dual relationship. On the one hand, you do have this security cooperation, but on the other hand, the establishments have a very tense relationship and a great deal of mistrust coming from the Jordanian side towards what it is that Israel has in store for Jordan in the long run. Both of these things continue to coexist.
Asher, as always, thank you for tremendous insight, detail, giving us a perspective that we often don't receive. We certainly don't read a great deal in our media about Jordan, never mind Israel, Jordan. It's simply not covered, and when it is, it's very superficial. So thank you. We too often look elsewhere for where some of the really important issues reside. And we'll look forward to having you back again.
Thank you very much.
And I urge everyone to read his newest book, as well as earlier ones that will inform you about Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. Les, over to you.
Thank you, David. I'd like just echo what David said. It's always a pleasure to have you here, Asher, to bring your expertise on things that sometimes we don't think about, in areas of, that we aren't always reading in the paper or scrolling through. So we really appreciate that very much. And again, look forward to having you back. And David and the panel, thank you very much too for your time and your efforts. And we look forward to the next Israel Dialogues. We're taking a couple of weeks off, but the next one is on Friday, December 13th, with Alan Pincus, who is the respected.
No, I'm sorry, Les. It's on December 6th with Mayor Litvak. Meyer will be speaking. He will be speaking on Iran, followed then the following week by Alan Pincus.
Great. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Thank you, David. And so we're on for December 6th and then December 13th. Hope you all can come back to us. And I'm not sure if he's still here, but part of our audience was one of our former presenters from Israel, Paul Lips. And I just want to give a shout out to him and thank him for coming all the way from Israel. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.